I absolutely love stories. I absolutely love stories, and if I wish I read more, but I don't. I read a little, and then I might get like a couple chapters in, like, man, this book's so good, and close it, put it on my nightstand, and not see it for another year or two, and like, man, I probably should have finished that book. Anybody else read like that? Are y'all okay? I'm not the only one thinking. Does anybody wish they read more? Anybody wish they read more? Absolutely. So, but what's so hard right now is to read is we've got so much stuff on television to watch, and there's so many streaming channels that I can watch all sorts of stories, and I ain't got to sit back and read unless I'm one of my youth or a few adults that love anime and read subtitles all day. So I know there's a few of y'all. So you read and watch at the same time, but I absolutely love stories, absolutely love stories. And the reason I do, it's much more than just like a beginning, middle, and end. The story isn't just those three parts. That the story is made up of the characters that are inside of the story that you fall in love with or you connect with, or there's something in you that just absolutely hates that character. There's character arcs that happen, and so there's a story arc that goes from beginning to end, but in the middle of that story, there's other small character arcs about them going through and what they discover and what they go through. And so absolutely incredible. I love movies. Movies are great, but I really love TV series. A movie's good, especially if it's a good 2-hour movie because you get a lot, but something about binge watching like 16 seasons worth of a show and like walking through and watch. Who in here has ever seen the show Monk? Y'all know what I'm talking about, Monk? Oh, yeah. So Pastor Jack and Miss Katie have recently discovered Monk, and I think we've knocked out like 4 seasons already in like just a few weeks. And so, but it's an absolutely incredible story, and I love stories. Like, who in here, do we have any Star Wars fans? Any big Star Wars fans? Okay. Does anybody like Lord of the Rings? Anybody like that? Okay. See, like, I love these stories because these type of stories transport you to another galaxy. These type of stories transport you to a different type of place. And at least with Lord of the Rings, there's elves and there's dwarves and all these other things that's cool. Star Wars, there's like lightsabers, and I think every kid enjoys watching a lightsaber. And so like you get to witness all these, and once again, you just find yourself lost and carried away in these stories that you either read about or that you watch about, and stories are incredible. And with all that being said, there's some incredible stories inside of the Bible. There are some absolutely incredible stories inside of the Bible, and here in a second, I want to read one, and I'll get to where we're going today, but I put this in my notes, and it's very simple, some great encouragement, but if you don't read your Bible, you should. If you don't read your Bible, you should. It's absolutely, not only do you get some incredible stories out of it and you get to hear some amazing things that take place, but other stories have been good. Other books that I've read have been great. But man, this is the only book that I've ever read that's absolutely changed my entire life. And so I just wanted to make a point real quick to say, read your Bible. Read your Bible. So today's going to kind of go like this. I've got 2 separate thoughts. When I go to transition, it'll just kind of be like a hard stop right into the next thing, and you're going to be like, where is he going with any of this? But I promise there is an area, there's a purpose to both of these things on which we are going. But if you have your Bibles, if I could have you open to John chapter 12. John chapter 12, and we're going to pause there. We're not going to read it quite yet because I want to give a little bit of backstory. A few years ago when I was in college, Pastor gave a few of us, 3 of us had to preach on a Wednesday night, and I was given a certain passage of scripture. And while I was reading and studying up on this story that is found in John chapter 11, I read over into John chapter 12, and I found this incredible like part of this story that's tucked away just a couple verses after John chapter 11. And I believe, it connects perfectly. And I'm like, man, why would you miss out on this? And so today I want to look at those 3 verses here in a little bit, and hopefully it impacts you as much as it impacted me. And every time I find myself reading through the book of John and coming to John chapter 12, I read these verses, and it still moves me like it did the very first time I did. But first, like I said, I want to give a little backstory. John chapter 11, we find out about 3 siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And these three siblings had a relationship with God, and they knew him. They were friends with God. The Bible even goes so far to tell us that Jesus loved these three. So this was more than just an acquaintance type thing, or, oh yeah, I met Jesus at Walmart the other day. It was like, we know each other. We've hung out with one another. He's been in our home. They spent time together. So he had a relationship with these three. And one day Lazarus became very sick. Lazarus became very sick, and as time went on, they realized that this sickness, Mary and Martha realized that this sickness was leading unto death. That unless something miraculous happens, Lazarus is going to die. And so once they've come to this realization, once they understand the severity of what Lazarus is going through and that the severity of this sickness, they have this thought. They said, you know what? We know who Jesus is. Not only is he our friend, but later one of the sisters even says, I know you're the Messiah. They knew who Jesus was, and that makes me aware that they probably knew that Jesus has performed miracles before, that he has opened blind eyes, opened deaf ears, the lame has begun to walk. And so they knew this about Jesus. So in their moment of desperation, in their moment of not wanting to see their brother die, they said, you know what? Send a message to Jesus and have him come. Send a message to Jesus and have him come. So the message is sent. And eventually the message arrives to Jesus, and Jesus hears the severity of the sickness, that Lazarus isn't doing good, that Lazarus is probably going to die. Please come. Please come. And so Jesus, in an incredible moment and an incredible act of kindness and an incredible act as such a great friend to these people, he sits back and goes, you know what? I think I'm going to wait 2 days. I think I'm just going to wait 2 days. And I kind of say it like that because I find it a little strange and a little funny that if Lazarus' sickness is this severe, if it's this bad, wouldn't you think Jesus would have a little haste to get to Lazarus to possibly cure him before he dies? And yet Jesus decides to wait 2 days. And I would dare say the messengers are like, are you kidding me? Maybe even the disciples who probably spent time with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus as well are like, Jesus, are we really waiting if it's this dire? Yet Jesus goes on to tell his disciples two things. Number one, he says this. He says, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. And the second thing he said is this. He says, this sickness happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God would receive glory. The sickness will not end in death, and it is for the Son of God to receive glory. So 2 days passed, and finally Jesus and his disciples, they pack up, they grab their things, and they head off to Bethany, where these siblings are from. And once they get to Bethany, once they arrived, news comes to Jesus. People come and tell him, hey, look, Lazarus has died. Lazarus is already dead. Not only that, as more information began rolling out, they found out that in the process of sending the message, the 2 days waiting and the track back, that not only is Lazarus dead, but he's been in the tomb already for 4 days. He's been in the tomb already for 4 days. So eventually word gets to Mary, word gets to Martha, and they find that Jesus has now arrived in Bethany, and each at separate time find themselves going to Jesus, and both look at Jesus and say the exact same thing. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. A few things transpire and take place, but eventually Jesus says, take me to Lazarus' tomb. Take me to the tomb. So they go. They go to the tomb, and when he gets there, he says, roll the stone away. And one of the sisters go, but he's been dead for 4 days. It stinks. He's like, roll it. So they roll the tomb away, and in a moment he says, God, thank you. Father, thank you for hearing me. And then in one of the most incredible moments of Scripture, he says, Lazarus, come out. And on that day, Lazarus ran out of his grave. And in that moment, the Bible said that it wasn't just like, he was like, what up, bros? And just walked out. It said that he was wrapped in his grave clothes. And as I was reading that, I think that's important. I think it's important that he was in there for 4 days. So Jesus proves his point that says, look, this dude was dead. He's wrapped in his grave clothes. His arms are bound. His head is wrapped. And he's walking out of this grave. And in this moment, he walks out, and Jesus says, unwrap him. And like I sit back and when I read that story, my mind is, I'm just so amazed at the power of God. That when Jesus speaks, death bows. That when Jesus speaks, the dead has to come back to life. And something that if we're not careful, we'll read these stories and we'll hear something as powerful as Lazarus being brought back from the dead. And like we hear these stories so much in church, we're like, yeah, that's a good story. And like we forget just how powerful of a moment this is. Just how powerful of a moment this is. Many of us, we can think of some bad things. We can go through some bad things, but like the thought process comes, yeah, but am I dead though? Like it could be worse. Like as bad as this is, it could be worse. Like death could be, because why? Death is always viewed as the end. Yet Jesus steps into a moment when everybody thinks something is ended. He said, Lazarus, come out. And where it ended, actually, it began again. And so it stands out to me, and I felt God press this upon my heart to speak it like this, that one thing that we need to realize is this. Jesus said that Lazarus' sickness will not end in what? Death. But what happened to Lazarus? He died. Even though Jesus said it wasn't going to end this way, didn't mean that Lazarus wasn't going to die. Like Lazarus still died, but Jesus came and had the power and said, Lazarus, come back to life. And so I don't really have anything to expound on that necessarily, but that's just something that God moved inside of me that hopefully maybe somebody will grasp on and think about for a moment. But it was an understanding that he knew what was going to happen. He knew that death wasn't going to be the end, but he realized that death was going to be something that took place in this story. And then the next thing is this, and I feel like a lot of us, honestly, if we're serious for a moment, we can connect with Mary and Martha. That when the moment came, their brother died. They're heartbroken for losing a loved one. They're heartbroken because they've lost someone they love. And here comes Jesus. Here comes their friend. Here comes the one, I bet the messengers came and said, look, Mary, look, Martha. He said he was waiting 2 more days. And I bet the thought process in their mind began to run like, does Jesus even care? Does Jesus even care about my situation? Does Jesus even care about the fact that my brother is about to die? And yet they come to him and they say, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not be dead. And I feel like some of us in this room might have or may have had that moment with God, and maybe right in this very moment that you're sitting back and you've experienced something in your life that's been extremely painful. You've experienced something in your life that's been very hard, and you sit back and say the exact same thing Mary and Martha said. You're saying, God, if you would have been here, God, why weren't you here? You say I'm your son. You say I'm your daughter. You say you love me. You say no weapon formed against me will prosper, but it looks like it's prospering right now. It looks like everything in my life, it looks like this situation that I've been dealing with is dead. And I feel God calling me to tell you this, he still can call dead things back to life. That the things in your life, the situations, he can still call dead things back to life. And so I just really, once again, I don't feel that's like for the whole group. I feel that that's very specific for a few in this room. And I don't mean a relative. I don't mean a physical body. I believe that there's some things in your life and situations that have looked dead for a while and that you've wept over and you've cried to God and you said, God, like, why weren't you here in this situation when I needed you most? And he's saying, I can still call those dead things back to life. And so I just want that to be an encouragement to you today, that once again, it doesn't matter how dead it looks. God is still able to call dead things back to life. God is still able to call dead things back to life. And then we get to the verses that I love. Then we get to the verses that absolutely move my heart. And I'm going to speak them. I'm going to read them. I want y'all to read with me. And some of y'all are going to be like, okay, what's the point? But allow it. Allow the context of the story we just read. Because of this, there was a plot to kill Jesus now. Because of what Jesus was doing, so many people began leaving the religion side of things, the traditional side of things, and they began following after Jesus. And it became so much of a problem, they said, we got to kill this man. We got to kill Jesus. So here we go. John chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. John chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. When all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus, the man Jesus raised from the dead. Then the leading priests decided to kill Lazarus too, for it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. For it was because of him that many of the people had deserted them and believed in Jesus. Check it. Jesus is in town. The one they call Messiah. The one who's done miraculous things. But I ain't going just to see him. I'm going to see this Lazarus guy too. Because Lazarus starts talking about that Jesus rose him from the dead. That he was physically dead, wrapped in grave clothes, yet God spoke to him and he came out of a grave one day. I'm not going just to see him, I'm going to see this guy too. What happened in his life? Why is he speaking like this? So here we go. Because of Lazarus and his testimony of what God did in his life, many people began following after Jesus. I say all this to get to this. There is power in your testimony. There is power in what God has done inside of your life. And this is why I'm saying it like this, because oftentimes God will have an amazing move in our lives. We might have had a moment just right now where we brought them empty jars and they began to get filled. And we had a moment and God did something great in our lives, yet we never go tell anybody about it. And some of that does come from fear. Some of that does come from an area where like, I don't know what to say. Like, I don't know what people or how people are going to respond. But it blows my mind that not only was Jesus leading so many people, making them leave their tradition, but because of Lazarus and his testimony, what he began to tell, they said, we got to kill this man too, because his testimony is too great. And I want to say it like this too. I grew up in church. I've heard many testimonies in my life. I've seen many people step on stage. And I'll put it like this. I ain't got a testimony like Pastor Mari Davis. And we look at that, and a lot of times we'll see someone who's been to jail, see someone who is that had murdered a man, and see somebody who's gone through all these things, and we look at that and we go, man, my testimony ain't good as that. What's my testimony going to do compared to that? And honestly, when we do that, we need to be careful, because we're saying, well, God's power in my life isn't as good as what it was in his life. So be careful of how you say, well, my testimony is not good enough. And I speak that from a place of, once again, growing up in church, I've heard them all. I've heard all sorts of testimonies. And I would sit back and go, well, I'm a pastor's kid. I didn't get in too much trouble. I watched my brothers do that. And so I learned from their mistakes. So, I grew up in church. I don't have no backslidden story. I didn't go off doing drugs and drinking and partying and hanging out with that's not my story. I grew up in church. My parents were pastors. My grandparents were pastors. My great-grandparents were pastors. Yet as I've grown up, I realized that is my testimony. My testimony is not necessarily of myself. It's a testimony of who my family is and the faithfulness of God from generation to generation to generation. And so I've learned that it's not about whose testimony is better, who can tell the better story. It's just sharing of what God's done in your life. And so there's power in your testimony. There's power in your testimony. And here's my awkward transition. Just letting everybody know we're going to switch here in a second. So June 27th through the 30th, I had the incredible opportunity of I, along with the best youth leaders in the world, let me give y'all a round of applause real quick. Pastor Hannah, Miss Maddie, Mr. Denny, Miss Megan, Mr. Alex, and my wife, Miss Katie, and my wife. We had the incredible opportunity of taking the JRNY youth family to youth camp. And I've been to camp pretty much my entire life. I've been as a camper at kids camp, youth camp. I've got to be a volunteer at camp, and I've also, now I'm a youth pastor at camp. So I've seen the many different roles. The only thing is camp intern, which you couldn't pay me enough to be no camp intern. So anyway, but I've been to camp many years of my life, but I will say this. Camp 2021 was the greatest year of youth camp I've ever experienced. It was absolutely the greatest year of youth camp that I've ever experienced. And I have many stories that I could tell about camp, many fun stories that I could tell about camp. I could talk about Joe Noon and some hot dogs. And being built different, he's like, don't look at me, huh? Some hot dogs. I could talk about some coffin dances. Some of the youth who were there know what that is. I could talk about mommy and how mommy loves camp. I could talk about una esperanza. Yeah. And so I could talk about our dodgeball games. And there's absolutely 100 stories I could probably tell about everything that happened at camp this year. And so, but I want to stick to the lines of testimonies. I want to stick to the lines of that our testimonies have power. And I want to share just a few testimonies of some of the things that took place in the lives of a few of the students at camp this year. And this is what I will present to you. I'm going to share these testimonies. I'm going to say a few words after, and then we're going to go into another time of worship. I believe if we're willing, and I believe it's just the Spirit working through service. I believe God has something in store for us today. And if we have a willingness to sit back and say yes, I believe God will do it. There's a culture in our TYM family, Tennessee Youth Ministries, for across the state. There's a culture that we've been building over the last few years, and there's some songs. They're very specific about songs that we sing and we worship and we praise to. And there's one song that was actually written from the culture itself. But with every beat of my heart, there's a resounding yes. It's just the fact that my heart cries yes to you, Lord. Another song that we sang this year is I Am Available. I am available. Do whatever you want to. I'm available. It's this understanding that it ain't about like what we come to Jesus and what we're asking him for. It's an understanding that we're building a culture and just saying, God, whatever it is that you want to do in my life, first, I'm available for whatever it is. And second, the answer is yes, regardless. And I feel like, can we have that mindset today and every day of our lives that when we come after God or we come into a moment or we go into our secret and quiet place and seek after him, can we have that same thought process of saying, God, I'm available to do whatever you want. And the answer is yes anyway. It might not look like what I thought it would. It might not sound like what I thought it would. It might be completely different than what I think I'm good at. But God, if you're calling me to do it, the answer is yes. Or if you want to just do that in my life, the answer is yes. So here's a few testimonies. The first one starts in 2019, Camp 2019. It was a moment of altar time, and so I come down to the altar and I begin praying for some students. And there was a specific student that I prayed for this night, and so I began praying for that student. And in the moment, God placed their name upon my heart, and like there was some weight to it. And it was kind of like an understanding of like, watch this student or pay attention to this student. And I fully didn't really understand what God was trying to tell me, but he said, watch. So that's what I did. So for the last 2 years, I've been watching this student. I've been paying attention. I've been praying about this student, just kind of filling out, wondering, God, what is it that you were trying to speak to me about this particular student? And so this had been a 2-year process. And so we arrived to Camp 2021. It's our second night of service. And while we're in the middle of worship, and just in the middle of worship, I felt God speak to me. He said, now. He said, now is the time to speak to this student. And I want you to tell him everything that I've been showing you about him for the last 2 years. I want you to speak that into his life. So I said, yes, sir. And in my mind, I was like, I'll wait till after service, allow God to do what he needs to do. And then after service, I'll pull him to the side and I'll talk to him. So service progressed. We went through the message, and for altar, everyone got called down to the front for altar time. And so they released the leaders to start praying for our students. So I went down and I started praying for a few students. Well, I found myself looking up at one point, and this particular student that God asked me to talk to, I look up and there's a random woman I've never met in my life just hugging this particular student. And as I'm looking, he's tears rolling down his face. And I want to pause and say this, just because you cry doesn't mean God's doing something in your life. Like, I know we can get emotional sometimes, but like when I looked upon his face, like I could tell there was a brokenness before God. And so I see tears streaming down his face, and I look and I'm like, I might not know the lady, but God's doing something. Let's go. So I was excited. So I began praying for a few more students, and I look up again, and now this lady's gone, and Pastor Brooks Till is there, and he's pretty much second in command at camp. He helps Pastor Jeremy, and so Pastor Brooks Till is there. Now Pastor Brooks is praying over him, and once again, man, kid's just crying, and God's doing something in his life, and I'm just like, heck yeah, God, like this is awesome. And so I began praying for a few more students, and after a while, I just began to worship and just thanking God for what he's doing. And as I open my eyes, one of our leaders, Mr. Denny, has the biggest smile on his face. And he grabs my arm. He says, it's your turn, Pastor Jack. And he pulls me into this particular student. And it was in that moment, I was like, God, now's the time. I'm assuming this is when you want me to speak. And so I did. Everything that God has been revealing to me about this student for the last 2 years, I just began to speak in his life. Began sharing the word that I felt God was wanting me to share with this particular student. And once again, if there's any place in my life that I've cried the most, it's at Camp Jackson. And I want to say that, like, it ain't unmanly to cry, and especially when you're broken before the Lord, man. And so, like, I just find myself in those moments a lot of times. I wrap up our students, and in the moment of just praying with them, I just begin to cry because I'm broken at what God is doing inside of their lives. And so I just began to cry with that student after speaking, and then service ended, and as we were kind of finishing up, this particular student was hanging back, and I was like, well, this ain't like him. And so anyway, but he pulled me aside. He said, hey, can we talk? And I said, sure. I was like, let's step outside so we can hear each other. And so I began talking with this student, and just, what is it? And he began to recall his side of the story. And he said, a woman I've never met in my life came up to me tonight and began speaking things into my life. And almost crying, recalling the story. And then he comes and he says, and then Pastor Brooks came up to me and he said some things in my life. And then Pastor Jack, you came up to me and you spoke some things into my life. And things were said, but practically all three of y'all spoke on the exact same thing over my life. And his question was, what do I do next? See, this particular thing that was spoken was not a calling of ministry or calling to an occupation, but it's a role that God spoke over his life to assume. And he said, what do I do next? And so I encouraged him just to get some food, sit down, and take a moment to breathe. But as I looked at his face and I heard his story and the understanding, he went and legit sat down and for the next couple minutes just stared. And it was incredible because I'm watching as this student had an encounter with his Heavenly Father. That God showed up in a way that he's never showed up in his life. And he's sitting there just absolutely shook of what God just did in his life. Second story. We had another student, very first night, we eat dinner, we get to service. We're not long into service that I feel a tug or someone getting my attention, and I look down and one of the students is crying. He's struggling to breathe, and he's like, Pastor Jack, I can't breathe. So I was like, well, this ain't good. So we took him to the nurse's station to get checked up on to make sure everything was fine. And the nurse began speaking to the student, and come to find out that there was some separation anxiety that he dealt with, and he was missing home, and he was missing his mom. And so the nurse just encouraged him to breathe, slow down his breathing, take big breaths. We got him some water, and she just began to talk to him about, hey, let's think about some of the fun things that you'll be doing this week at camp. And after that moment, we stepped outside, and both of us pretty much missed the entirety of service or the entirety of worship because we began playing carpet ball, spiritual things. We began shooting basketball. We kept that hush. I guess I just let it out of the bag. That's what I was doing during worship the first night. But we just kind of played a little bit. We joked a little bit. We talked a little bit. And then he seemed good enough, and we went back into the sanctuary. And everything seemed to be okay. And I was like, man, if you could just get through this first night. And one thing he kept saying is this. He was like, I do miss my mom. I do miss being home, but I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave. And it was just a struggle he was having of missing home, but at the same time knowing that this is where he wanted to be. And so this is where it was. So the very next day we get up, we start playing games. They're out all over the field. They're out all over throwing footballs, capturing flags, and they're having an absolute great time. And this particular student's having a great time. And that night of service, he's worshiping down front, jumping up and down. And I'm like, yes. Like I knew if he could just stay, all would be good. And so we get to the final night of service. We get to that final night of service, and after worship, I go to sit down. I look to my left, and the same student is crying again. And I'm going, oh no, we made it so far. It's the final night of camp. And so I take him, we walk outside, we sit on a park bench. I had an extra bottle of water handed him, and I was like, hey, do you miss your mom? Is that what's going on? He goes, no. He said, in the middle of service, in the middle of worship, I heard a voice speak to me, and it said, you're not good enough. He said, but immediately I heard another voice that said, everything's going to be okay. And he said, I felt God place his hand on my shoulder. And so I'm sitting here talking to a student who's crying and just kind of like trying to catch his breath because he's just had such an encounter with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And he, just the same as the first one, is shook because God was so real in that moment. And then on the final night, that final night, it's our last time together as a camp. So after altar, after our groups have prayed, we're going to give it our all in praise to God. If you were here last week, you heard the I Thank God song that we sang. We did that for like, what felt like 30, 45 minutes. And man, we didn't stop jumping. We didn't stop praising. We didn't stop worshiping because we've been through way too much this week. We've seen God do way too much this week that, you know what, at the end of it all, it's just like, well, we just got to give you praise. And God, I do thank you for all that you've done. And so we're worshiping. We're shouting, we're dancing, we're praising. It's not just a show, we're doing it unto him. And so we're worshiping, and the next thing I know, the camp interns have these flags, and they start running through the congregation, running through the students, and they start handing flags to students. And two of our students got them flags. One of them was the one who had 3 people speak over to his life, and he don't just worship. Like, he's got this lane he walks, and so he starts jumping up and down, and he's singing, he's shouting, he's waving his flag, and I'm just like, let's go. And then I look over, and another one of our students has a flag, and where this one's just walking back and forth, I look up, this kid's gone. He just takes off running, and he's down the front, and he's just waving the flag, and they both begin passing the flag off to other students and seeing the other students waving the flag. And man, I'm sitting there jumping. I'm sitting there yelling, shouting, like doing everything. And as I looked around, I saw the biggest smiles in my life. I saw the biggest smiles in my life. I saw kids worshiping like they ain't never worshiped before. I saw students with such joy on their faces for the first time in forever. I know 2020 has been hard on everyone. I know that some of us in this room has experienced COVID and had to go to the hospital, and like it ain't no joke. I know some of us have lost some loved ones in the midst of 2020 and everything that has gone on. And I'm not saying that one has had it worse than another, but I want to say this. 2020 was extremely hard on our teens and on our children. And I say it like this, and I was talking to my mom the other day, and this isn't a hit against the youth, but y'all understand, there is a level of maturity that teens and kids have not yet reached in their life. And there was such an upheaval of everything that they've ever known take place, and where we might have experienced some life change in the past, where we might experience some dramatic things take place in the past. Like, we're mature enough, hopefully, to know how to emotionally handle some of these things. These students don't. These students didn't know how to handle everything that was going on. And for many of them who had some really bad home lives, man, now they're stuck in home 24/7, and like it's all they know. And so 2020 has been a really tough year on these kids. And I'll tell you this, I saw the life sucked out of a lot of them through this year, through this past year. And so to walk into that moment and see them kids worshiping, to walk into that moment, and I focus in on our group because that's our group. But at the same time, that entire sanctuary was seeking after him. And as I sat there, there was such a sense of overwhelming joy. Such a sense of overwhelming joy. There's so many more stories, so many more testimonies, cards that I can flip through and read off. Man, I dealt with some bad anxiety and depression, but I felt that lifted from me this week. I was dealing with some things in my life, some weights holding me down, but I've been lifted. Some things I've been struggling with, I've been set free from. And I can go through these cards. It's incredible to watch what God did in these students' lives. And ultimately, I say all that to come to this. One, there's power in these testimonies that have been shared. But also this, the same God that moves in their lives at Camp Jackson is the same God that can move in our lives in this very place. The very place. God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't care if you're young, old, rich, poor, black, white. We children of God. We're children of God. And once again, I believe something shifts so dramatically in those moments because we do posture our hearts and posture ourselves to say yes to whatever. God, that I'm available to whatever. The older we get, I feel that we get to a point where it's like, well, it's got to be this and this. And that's just the mindset. But for youth and for teens, sometimes it's just, God, I don't know. I just need you. And I'm just saying yes to whatever you have. And maybe, just maybe, some of us in this room need to change our hearts a little bit and posture towards the Lord, that it ain't about receiving certain things. It's just saying, God, whatever it is that you want from me, I'm available. As we already sang, I will make room for you to do whatever you want to. Whatever you want to. If I could have the worship team return, please. Every head bowed and every eye closed. My heart and my prayer as I've been preparing for this day is this, that in this moment, I just felt like this is where we needed to go. But I also want to say this, I ain't trying to make something happen. I ain't trying to force something to happen. But for a little bit longer today, can we just take a moment to lift our hands? Maybe even sing the song, maybe not even sing it all and just sit there with our hands raised and say, God, do whatever you want to today. There's no quote unquote altar call. This is what I'm going to ask. If you could stand, would you please stand with me today? And I'm going to ask for y'all to step out of your comfort zone a little bit. I'm going to ask for everyone who's able, can we make our way down to the altar today? If you're able, can you make your way down to this altar today? Don't allow the pew to be your cage keeping you from stepping out. And I know it's different. I know it's different. But as we get to this place, can we close our eyes once again and can we just raise our hands? And can we just say, God, whatever it is that you want to do in my life today, do it. God, I don't come with my agendas. I don't come with the things that I'm needing you to do. God, I'm just simply, Lord, today I'm declaring that I'm available. And I'm saying yes to whatever it is. God, even if it looks like something that don't even make sense to me, even if it's like, God, where did that come from? But God, if it's of you, the answer is yes. And so I'm available. In your hearts today, right now, and with your words, can we just declare that to God, that God, I'm available. God, I'm available to all that you want to do today. Some of y'all have grown up and y'all have been to camp. Some of y'all have grown up and you've experienced moments in the presence of God today that you have a testimony alike a lot of these students of where you had an incredible moment with God that took place inside of your life. Some of y'all, it's been a long time since that's happened. And today, don't try to be like, well, God, it's got to be like this. God, that's how it happened last time. Just say no. Lord, I just want more of you. God, I want whatever you have for me. So come on, can we worship for a moment? Can we worship for a moment?
Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. This is where I lay it down. Every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. This is where I lay it down. Every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down. Every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender. Yes. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. And I will make room for you, yes, to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to, yeah. Come and have your way. Come and have your way in my heart today. We're open, we're open. We're open, we're open. Come and have your way in my heart today. We're open, we're open. Here is where I lay it down. Every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. This is where I lay it down. Every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to, do whatever you want to. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to, do whatever you want to, yeah. Break down the walls of all my tradition. Break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Your way is better. Shake up the ground to all my tradition. Break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Your way is better. Shake up the ground to all my tradition. Break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better, so much better. Your way is better. Shake up the ground to all my tradition. Break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Your way is better. Your way is better.
Yeah. To the one that can call the dead back to life, your way is better. To the one that could speak to 3 separate people to speak to 1 student, your way is better. To the one who would be willing to place his hand on a shoulder and declare to a student that everything's gonna be okay, your way is better. To the one that gives overwhelming joy, your way is better. God, sorry if I've made plans for my life. Lord, sorry if I've come to you with any type of agenda. Lord, saying that if it don't happen like this, But God, may I just come to you every day of my life and Lord, say, I'm available. Lord, for whatever it is that you want to do in my life, I'm available. And God, the answer to everything you say is yes. Yes. Lord, even when I don't feel like it, it's yes. Lord, even when I don't want to say it, it's yes.